Okay, so good evening if you're in the UK, and hello, wherever else you are. This is a talk by me and Jen. We're talking about bone wars and lost worlds, so dinosaurs and the creative imagination in the 19th and early 20th centuries. I'm going to talk to you a bit about the actual bone wars and explain what was going on and who was doing what. And then Jen will take you through a little bit of what was around before the time in terms of dinosaur representation in art, things like that. And then we'll talk a bit about how stuff changed once the bone wars and sort of the whole dinosaur craze really took off, and what some of the creative responses were to it. Okay, the skeleton you can see here will be important later. This is an Elasmosaurus. Look at that long necky thing, mostly neck. Keep that in mind. I'll come back to it shortly. Okay. Oh, turn that very well. Never mind. Okay, so this is my part of the talk. I'm going to give you it's a very brief overview, really, to the bone wars. So. How it all started, and then I'll talk a bit about Cope and Marsh, who are sort of protagonists, where they dug and what they found. And that picture, it's a bit blurry, I'm sorry, on the right hand side is a picture of two of the dinosaurs at Crystal Palace Park in London. If you've ever been, you'll recognise them. If you haven't been, it's well worth a trip. So these were done for the Great Exhibition in London in the 1850s by a sculptor called Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins. And at that point, it was assumed that all dinosaurs walked on four legs. We'll come back to that as well in a second. Okay, so this is where it started. This is a Hadrosaurus phocii skeleton, so in a sort of slightly painted in photograph. In 1868, this went on display at the Philadelphia Academy of Natural Sciences. It had been discovered about 10 years, 11 years before in New Jersey, where there have been since even more sort of discoveries of dinosaur skeletons. And it was dug up by someone called William Parker Folk, so that's where the name of the dinosaur came from. This was the first attempt to sort of mount a dinosaur specimen so that it looked like the animal. Okay, they weren't entirely sure what it would have looked like, obviously, and the skull in particular was a bit of a fabrication. But this was really the first I suppose, suggestion that actually quite a lot of dinosaurs were bipedal. And so they mounted this one in a standing position on its back legs. And it actually turns out that, yeah, this was more or less right. It wasn't quite as upright as this, but it was certainly bipedal. And the gentleman in the picture you can see there, that is Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins, he of the Crystal Palace dinosaurs. He was also responsible for building this model as well. For 15 years, it was the only mounted dinosaur skeleton on display in the world, as far as we know. It was copied. They made plaster copies of it and sent it to other museums, mostly in the United States, Canada, but they did actually send one to the Royal Museum of Scotland in 1879. And it was put on display there. I have looked through the catalogues. I can't find it, so I don't know what they've done with it. In any case, it did masses for their visitors. So normally they would expect, coming through the Academy, about 30,000 visitors a year. So that more than doubled the first year that the Hadrosaur was on display. In the second year, it went up to 100,000. And the museum actually ended up having to acquire a new building to cope with all of the people that were wanting to come and see it. Okay, now we're on to the Bone Wars. We've got two protagonists, basically. Othniel Charles Marsh on the left there, and on the right, Edward Drinker Cope. There's some very splendid facial hair going on. So let me tell you a little bit about these guys. So Othniel Charles Marsh, he's always described as, excuse me, coming from a modest background, but his uncle was George Peabody, who was sort of a banker and philanthropist, and ended up forming the company that became JP Morgan, the bank. So quite a lot of money going on there. And George Peabody very kindly paid for Othniel's education and travels. And so he went off to university. He studied various places in the US, but also over in Europe, including Berlin. And he studied anatomy, mineralogy, geology, and paleontology. And on his return, he became a teacher at Yale College and began his sort of career as a paleontologist. He was not considered to be a cheerful person. He was known behind his back as the Great Dismal Swamp. So, bit of a misery guts, but whatever. And he, in terms of his own beliefs, he was a Darwinist. You know, he even undertook work on fossils of horses, looking at evolution, which actually provided physical evidence that supported Darwin's work. And now on to Edward Cope. So Edward Drinker Cope, wealthy family, very wealthy family. Completely different attitude towards study though. He wasn't really that bothered about studying, wasn't that keen on science. So very little formal training. What he knew, he'd learned from doing it. And he didn't teach either. He just liked, I suppose he liked digging, or more to the point, telling other people to dig. He came from a Quaker family, so very strict interpretation of the Bible, at least in his family. And he was aware that there was something of a problem in marrying up the sort of biblical belief with his work on dinosaurs. He wasn't a Darwinist though. He was a neo-Lamarckian. So Lamarckianism is the idea that organisms pass on to their offspring physical characteristics that they've acquired during life. Okay, so for example, a giraffe, this is the way he described it, a giraffe, Lamarck described it, sorry, stretches its neck up to reach the leaves. It makes its own neck longer and stronger, and then therefore this would be passed on to its offspring, which, okay, but it's really bonkers if when you realize that means, for example, a bodybuilder human being would have bodybuilder children. So yeah, it doesn't really work at all. On top of that, he was also a massive racist, and he even wrote sort of 3 volumes of work on various aspects of evolution and what have you. And in one of them, The Origin of the Fittest, essays on evolution, he basically laid out that white people are superior, and he justified imperialism on that basis as well. And just to convince you that he's a charming guy, he was also against women's rights and didn't believe that women should have the vote because they would just do what men told them to do. So why were they such fierce rivals? Well, 2 reasons really. The first was that when they first met in Berlin, they were sort of fairly chummy, and they both returned to the US and started working together under a gentleman called Joseph Leidy, who was sort of an eminent paleontologist, the eminent paleontologist of his time. And Leidy was digging up specimens from the site in New Jersey where the hadrosaur had been found. And Marsh, chap on the left there, was quietly paying ladies, workmen, to send the specimens to him rather than to Edward Cope. Obviously didn't go down well. The other thing that turned them against each other was the elasmosaur, so that skeleton that I had on the title page. So this was a reconstruction that they'd done together. It was a skeleton that Cope had excavated a few years before, and they put it all together and sort of trying to work out what went where, and they were looking at it, and Cope said, I think the head goes on that end. So he was looking at the shorter end, saying, well, you know, it would have a shorter neck than tail. Maybe it's got a really long tail, we'll put it on the other end. Marsh looked at it as well and said, no, I reckon the skull goes on the long end. They couldn't agree, so they got in touch with Professor Lady, who came to referee, if you like. He looked at the skeleton and he agreed with Marsh that the skull should go on the long bit. And it is a long neck. It's something like 74 neck vertebrae, which is madness. Anyway, Cope had already written and published a paper on the elasmosaur, and now was mortified that he'd been proven wrong. And so he rushed around trying to buy up all the copies of this paper that had been sold or published or whatever. Inevitably, some of them got through, and people took the mickey, and he never really forgave Marsh for that. Okay, let's go on to excuse me. Let's go on to some of the actual digging that they did. Now, before I get into that, I think it's really important to point out that the land that they were digging on already belonged to people. So there were Native American people there already and had been sort of suffering all kind of privations and repression as white settlers moved westward. And you can see in this little map thing here, sort of by 1870, the green, which is Native American possession, really disappears hugely. And so there were, while there were Native Americans on and around the sites where Cope and Marsh were digging, they had been largely sort of moved into reservations, and were very marginalized. The two men were not wildly supportive of Native people. You can imagine Cope's point of view, being a white man. Marsh, slightly more mixed. He actually made friends with a Lakota leader called Red Cloud, and tried to persuade Red Cloud to let him have access to a particular site. Red Cloud said no, sensibly. And Marsh sort of came back to him and said, okay, look, give me access to this site, and I'll go and speak to the president, whoever in Washington, DC, and see if we can get some concessions for Indigenous Americans. Red Cloud didn't believe him and just said, no, you can't have it. In any case, Marsh went in and stole the stuff anyway. So he went in and excavated and removed material. But he did go to Washington, DC, and he did talk to somebody high up and got concessions for Native Americans. Obviously, they were so abysmally treated already that any concession was, not really very much. But Red Cloud is quoted as saying that he felt that Marsh had actually done okay by him. I don't know how much of that we should take with a pinch of salt. Obviously, there's some propaganda value in there. Anyway. So the area we're looking at as the sort of the epicenter of the Bone Wars is the Morrison Formation. So this is a formation which was got it here, an alluvial plain. So that's basically a big wet area, if you like. So not a not a lake, not necessarily a swamp, place where lots of rivers and streams. So there'd be sandbanks, islands, small areas of land. It was subtropical at the time, so plants, you know, big things like ginkgos and cycads and conifers that we would probably recognize now. It's sort of Upper Jurassic, so 156 to 146 million years ago. So this is before the Rockies were formed. And it covers an area of sort of 1.5 million square kilometers. So it's massive. You can see it's centered on Wyoming, to the south of Wyoming, Colorado, but goes into, you know, North and South Dakota, Montana, Idaho, New Mexico, into Utah, all over the place. It's absolutely enormous. And it's named after a town in Colorado called Morrison, which is where the formation was first identified in 1877 by a chap called Arthur Lake. The Morrison Formation, it's a lovely stripy thing. You know, it's those nice cliffs that look really cool in like sunsets and things like that. And it's sort of various layers of mudstone, sandstone, siltstone, limestone, volcanic ash beds, which are really useful in dating it, and also coal. So up in the north, so Montana, it was a more swampy area. So where you have swamps, you get trees and what have you fall over, get buried in the sediment and under the water, and then they get compressed, and eventually after millions of years they turn into coal. Your mudstone and siltstone, those are very fine sediments like you'd find in the bottom of a river. Limestone is generally little shells and beasties like that. Sandstone can be alluvial, so it can be from rivers, but it also turns up, particularly here in the south of the formation, as sand dunes. So we know that to the south at that point in time, it was extremely arid. Okay. So I've picked out one particular site that was really key to both Marsh and Cope. They both excavated here many times, and they weren't the only teams there. So there would have been perhaps 4 or 5 excavation teams in any one season digging stuff up. You can see, so the photograph there, it's a bluff. It's what we would call, geologically speaking, it's an anticline. So it's where the rock, where the layers have been bent by tectonic movement, and then eroded away. So you end up with a bluff like this. On the top of it, that's your Cretaceous rock, sort of the browny orange stuff in the photo. At the bottom, you've got Middle Jurassic, mostly on the valley floor in this picture. And then in between, all of that stuff in between is the Morrison Formation, which is where they were digging the dinosaurs out from. And this went on year after year. There were dig teams all over the place. So they'd have been at Camo Bluff, but many other places as well, places like Morrison, Colorado, and almost anywhere you can think of that is now famous for dinosaur bones. So, you know, North and South Dakota, places like that. And both men basically had loads of money. Obviously, Marsh was backed by his uncle. Cope had his own fortune, and it meant that they could pay for teams of men to just go out and dig, not necessarily be there themselves. I imagine they would turn up occasionally to, I don't know, suggest helpful things. Anyway, so that was the kind of terrain they were working in. So very dry, very hot, and very, very full of dinosaurs. Let me see what they dug up. So These are just a few of the species that they dug up. So all kinds of favorites here. So we've got Brontosaurus, and Apatosaurus. We've got Allosaurus, which is a lot like a T-Rex. Over on the left, we've got Stegosaurus, various kinds of things. And these were all being shipped east to museums on the East Coast and put on display, and sort of therefore driving this sort of mania for dinosaurs. Dinosaurs were not necessarily found articulated. So in many cases, they were found in what are known as catastrophic death formations, which is an amazing, no, death formation will do, and which is an amazing name for a black metal group. So these catastrophic death formations are basically where you've had dinosaurs who have been killed by perhaps natural disaster, something like that, could have been flood, whatever, and they all get washed into one big area and all sort of get mummified, fossilized together. And they get intermingled, so the bones get mixed up, and then it's up to the paleontologist to sort of work out what belongs to who. In other cases, it may have been, much more gentle, in that simply a dinosaur fell into the water as it died, was washed down the river, and would have ended up maybe on the inside of a bend, somewhere like that, and there would have been perhaps a few of these dinosaurs ended up there, and then same thing happened. So they all got mixed up. So these almost bone caches, if you like, were absolutely rammed full of loads of stuff. So, they were digging up and shipping out literal cartloads of bones. And both Marsh and Cope sent back so much material that there were, researchers were still opening boxes 30 years after both men had died. So an awful lot of bones to go through. Now, so that was all quite exciting, but actually come back to the rivalry. So Marsh and Cope were both very driven men. They both wanted to win. They both wanted to get the best, the biggest, and the largest number of specimens. So they resorted to bribery, like we've already heard with the excavators in New Jersey, but they would do that sort of routinely. Theft, they weren't above nicking boxes of bones off each other. Sabotage, so sending men out to, break the odd cart, whatever, try and keep bones from being taken off site. And they'd even go out and dynamite each other's excavation sites on the basis of, if I can't have it, nobody can. This animosity was very, very public. They would write articles about each other. They would basically slag each other off any chance they got. And this, it made paleontology look bad in general. Who would want to be involved with those kind of people? Meanwhile, everybody was quite keen to see the dinosaurs, but, not so keen on the people who were digging them up. It had a knock-on effect on other paleontologists, which is that, in particular, because there was so much material being found, other paleontologists basically abandoned being methodical and being scientific about their excavations, and just kind of hoiked the stuff out of the ground and stuck it on carts. So a lot of kind of the detail would have been lost. A lot of sort of context and things like that would have been lost, and perhaps even sort of fine details of the actual specimens themselves. So this whole bone wars did sort of nothing for scientific method at all. And ultimately it led to Joseph Leidy withdrawing from the field. So the chap who had arbitrated over the Elasmosaurus had been a mentor to both Marsh and Cope, was so horrified by this kind of public ongoing mudslinging that he just sort of threw up his hands and said, I'm not doing this anymore. He withdrew from the field, he retired, and he basically went and hid himself away. And so his legacy, if you like, has been largely lost because he just didn't want to do it anymore. And so other names kind of came up and became more famous. So Joseph Leidy, who's, you know, a really, really important paleontologist of the mid 19th century North America, basically went incommunicado because these two guys just couldn't leave each other alone. But legacy. So, I mean, so much stuff. Marsh published something like 300 papers, reports, and books based on his research. He described and named 496 new species. So just because you've dug something out of the ground doesn't mean it's yours. You know, you have to describe it. You have to ascertain that it's a new thing, and then you have to publish on it. And so, yeah, 496 new species. So that would include sort of mammals and birds and horses and stuff like that, but also 80 dinosaur species. And his specimens basically filled up the Peabody Museum and the Smithsonian. So all of that stuff is still on display. Cope, on the other hand, 1,400 plus papers. I don't know how he had time, frankly. 3 major books. He described over 1,000 fossil vertebrates, so again, mammals, birds, whatever, and 56 new dinosaur species. Both men ended up penniless. At this point, we're all going, hurrah! Marsh basically ran out of the money that his uncle had given him, and Cope, having spent a lot of his money on collecting dinosaurs, then invested in mining, and it went really badly wrong, and he ended up losing everything and had to sell his personal collection. So that was dispersed sort of all over the place to different museums and other private collections. But we do have the legacy of public fascination with dinosaurs. You know, people could, for the first time, go and walk through enormous rooms filled with these incredible creatures and try to imagine, you know, what they must have looked like alive and basically how terrifying they were. And it fueled sort of the creative response that Jen's going to talk about too. But how many specimens were lost to science? All of that dirty dealing, all of that sabotage and dynamiting, and also the sort of lack of scientific methodology that sort of other paleontologists resorted to in just an attempt to try to keep up with Marsh and Cope. You know, how many things were actually lost as a result of this? Okay, those are my sources. Do we have any questions?
Okay, so in the beginning, there was natural philosophy and naturalists. Naturalists were those who basically sought a greater understanding of nature and the cosmos. And in the early modern era, which was specifically in the 17th and 18th centuries, naturalists were working to understand the world through a biblical perspective of the world, but they were trying to understand it. But this also meant that when they were looking at geological questions, they were filtering this through an understanding that basically the biblical flood had definitely happened and was probably the cause of any mysterious things, and also that the 6 days of creation were a real event. So this was a very limited concept of pre-human deep time, but in an effort to communicate it, usually through biblical illustrations, that involved that created a whole tradition of art that showed basically a sequential progression of the earth changing through the stages of creation, and it was always headed towards a state that was more fit for human habitation and for civilization. Oh, I have that in. I'm missing a slide. Sorry. One second. Give me just a second. Okay, so imagine that this is the slide that was up during everything that I just said. So the most influential of those works illustrating the creation was the book, the Physics Sacra, also known as the Copper Bible. It was published by Johann Jacob Schweitzer in 1733. And it was a massive work that Schweitzer was trying to illustrate the entire known history of the Earth using the science of the time. He was a natural philosopher, and he was also an avid collector of marine fossils, which he took as evidence of the flood, because obviously the world had been one way and then it was another, and there was one explanation for that as far as he was concerned. So yeah, it was huge, 745 illustrations. And it was just, it's a really beautiful book. It's available online. I'm going to look at a few of the days of creation. So here, for example, we have, well, the third day of creation, which is the creation of the dry ground, seas, plants, and trees. So this is demonstrating a world without animals or humans. So there are no living creatures that witness this world. This is a world that is only known through scripture. And then on day 5, we see in this illustration, God created the sea creatures and every living creature that moves, with which the water swam. And we have here illustrations of, fish. If it was a more detailed copy, we could see things in the air. If you look on the right, all of those seashells, most of those are actually fossils. And so that's him saying that this is where these things were. They were definitely part of creation. They were part of God's plan. They're out there somewhere. The flood just got rid of them where we are. And then we have day 6. On the left there, you can see the animals are starting to populate the earth. And on the right, we have the creation of man, which has a frame that is surrounded by little skeletons that there's some debate about the symbolism of that. Probably a reminder that humans die. I don't know, Sam could probably comment on the theology of that there better than I could. So this was how people saw the world. And but by the late 18th century, so about 70 years after this book has come out, these naturalists that are studying the earth, well, they had all kind of, because they'd been looking closely and they'd all seen the same thing, that the earth was definitely built up of layers of strata, and that had to have been laid down over time, in that so something like the story of the flood had happened, but it had happened multiple times. And that inside of these strata, there were these remains of different kinds of animals that they were giants, or they were animals that were like nothing that had ever been seen or known. And they were coming up with increasingly convoluted ways to explain them. But they still, these philosophers, they still they believed that what they were learning was somehow going to confirm confirm the Bible. That was their goal. And so they even though this seemed to like raise some questions about creation, they still wanted to communicate it. However, when you're trying to like take something that has been communicated visually through art, like in the Copper Bible, you really need something more dramatic to get your point across than charts like this. This was a chart that was used to teach geology by William Buckland at Oxford in the early 19th century. So yeah, part of the problem, again, like the explanation for these fossils was that during these catastrophes, they had moved to somewhere else on the earth. And because it was, we were getting reports regularly from exploration of the rest of the world that there were environments very different from northern England, excuse me, from northern Europe, and there were specimens of really strange animals coming in all the time. So it really made more sense in this worldview that they were out there somewhere than that God or God had let something go extinct, because that also violated the concept of the chain of being, which was the idea that the universe has a very orderly hierarchy and everything in the world has a specific place. So anything being allowed to be removed from that brought that into question as well. But that all changed in 1800 when the French zoologist Georges Cuvier, who in the process of developing the brand new science of comparative anatomy, which is basically being able to look at animals and identify whether or not they are the same species, got his hands on samples of Asian elephants and African elephants, thanks to well, things that were being brought home from countries being conquered and wars. And so he was able to look at them and he realized that there were enough differences in the bones that they were different. They were different species, which was also a kind of a brand new concept that, you know, an elephant wasn't just an elephant, there were different elephants. He then got his hands on some fossils coming out of North America that turned out to be mammoths. And when he compared them, he showed also that they were different species. And by this time, there had been enough expeditions across North America that it was extremely unlikely that somebody had managed to get all the way from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean and not seen a gigantic elephant that was even bigger than any of the known elephants. It was the most likely explanation was that that animal didn't exist anymore, because they also would have come across it wherever else in the world it was. So as that idea sort of sank into the scientific community, made its way over to England, where the sciences of geology was also being developed, that gave them new options. So over the next 2 decades after this, they got more evidence for this. They started finding things that were really weird. Nearly complete skeletons out of Lyme Regis of Dorset of an ichthyosaur, a plesiosaur, and eventually pterosaurs, and also there was a pterodactyl that was found in Germany. And so because of with this new scientific technique of comparative analysis, they realized that they were reptiles. They had more things in common with lizards than they did with fish or bats, and that they were coming out of, you know, a really deep level of that strata of the earth, and were definitely from a world that had been destroyed by one of these catastrophes and were gone, just completely gone from the world. That just it basically kind of broke things, and they had to come up with a new way of looking at the world, especially with plesiosaurs, because you could understand that the ichthyosaur, it looked kind of like a fish or a whale. A pterodactyl kind of looked like a bat. There's a frame of reference for that, but a plesiosaur was weird. It didn't look like a whale. It had that gigantic long neck, and it had 4 paddles that didn't really look like flippers. It was so weird that it was completely otherworldly. But at the same time, they're holding these fossils in their hands, and they can't deny that these things were real, and that they had in fact once had a place in creation. So there came about a new tradition of art in efforts to depict this ancient world. That tradition we would call today PaleoArt. Here's a list of artworks that I will be going through, if anybody wants to grab that. So this right here, the Duria and Antiquior, is the first attempt to illustrate the concept of deep time. And it includes, as you can see, there's a plesiosaur, there's ichthyosaur biting it, there's pterodactyls in the air, there's a big lizard-like thing over on the shore that was based on another animal that had recently been described, and they only had pieces of it. They just knew that it was a lizard, and that it was a reptile, and it was big, and they assumed it looked like a lizard. This became the archetype of what the ancient world looked like. This, as we'll see in a second, this work of art was widely imitated. It was also very popular as a print. It was sold originally as part of a fundraiser for Mary Anning, the fossil collector out of Lyme Regis, who worked very closely with the Geological Society and actually discovered the plesiosaur and the ichthyosaur and I believe a pterodactyl. So this was meant to this was sort of a fun thing he drew for her that showed the world she had done. It's also got fossils and plants that had also been found in the area. So we have this work that if you look closely, you can see pterosaurs in the sky. You can see big lizard things on the ground. There's an ichthyosaur. There's a plesiosaur. We have an ichthyosaur, pterosaurs in the sky. We have there is a little plesiosaur around there. And we have another one, which it's a blatant copy of the excuse me, Duria antiquior, Duria antiquior, excuse me, that very similar and was very widespread. So this is sort of a collection of things from over about the next 10 years up until the 1840s. This is from a children's book, The Wonders of Geology, which has it's very simplified down to a pterosaur in the sky, a plesiosaur, and an ichthyosaur. So that's what everybody thought of it. Thought the ancient world looked like. It was very pastoral, kind of peaceful, except for like the thing where an ichthyosaur was sometimes biting onto a plesiosaur. And then the Gothic got injected into it. And that came with the influence of John Martin. So John Martin was a Romantic painter who, I gotta hurry up. He was known for his dramatic illustrations of Paradise Lost. He was a painter of the sublime with a style that emphasized vastness of scale, dramatic atmospheric effects, and scenes of tragedy and destruction. This is a list of works we'll be looking at of his. He made a name for himself with a depiction of the flood that he called the Deluge. And as you can see, this big sweeping landscape, you can't even see the ark unless you know where it is, which was a change from past depictions of the flood. The ark is usually like the dominant feature of those illustrations, whereas the thing here is, nature is collapsing down on them. There's water coming in. All those people are just basically they're desperate and they're waiting to die. That line is an arc of lightning that is hitting them. This got the attention of several paleontologists and geologists who wanted big dramatic pictures to make their books about fossils look more interesting so they would sell better. That's a close-up of it. And so we get the Country of the Iguanodon, which was the frontispiece of a work of are in 1838. So as you can see, this is very different from those old pastoral scenes. It looks like a bunch of dragons fighting each other. He had a complete disregard for depicting anatomical accuracy. It doesn't really look like anything. Those are supposed to be iguanodons, some of the things they thought looked like giant lizards around then. So he basically took these extinct animals that hadn't been presented as anything scary. They were just weird, and turned them into something really monstrous and horrifying. It's more reminiscent of demons or medieval dragons. You can see that here as well in the sea dragons as they lived with, this is the plesiosaurs and the ichthyosaurs that are usually just hanging out in the ocean in the previous works. And then we have the Age of Reptiles, which this just looks like medieval dragons to me. That's just what it looks like, with the big tongues and the claws. And the plesiosaur, he changed the paddles to look like big claws again. Like he didn't care about it being accurate. He wanted to make it look cool, essentially. So this was 1842, and then all of this kind of together turned depictions of dinosaurs into people could look at it and understand that it was a real thing. They were animals, but it also had elements that were very dramatic and sort of, this apocalyptic aura around them because they'd been wiped out by something, and they were from an age that was not appropriate for humans because no human remains had been found with them. So they must have been dangerous and monstrous. So then we have the Dinosaurs of Crystal Palace, which was a sculpture that you can still see today in London that Lindsay talked about. This is the sketch of it, which does resemble very much the layout, excuse me, the earlier traditions of depicting the ancient past. You've got the ichthyosaur, the plesiosaur. We have giant lizard-like things over on the island. If they could have, they do on the corner have a pterosaur who's sort of sitting on a rock. And there's a picture of them. So moving on, excuse me. Anyway, so we're coming out of, actually, excuse me. Okay, so coming out of the mid-19th century, we've got this image of what the world looks like. And we have these sea monsters, we have these bat-like pterodactyls, we have a huge lizard beast just kind of shuffling around in these swampy environments. And in the second half of the 19th century, especially later towards the 1870s, writers of sensational and fantastic adventure novels started putting these creatures into their books because they were really popular and they sold. And so we have, in 1864, Journey to the Center of the Earth, written by Jules Verne. A lot of people don't know that it was actually illustrated when it was published. The English translation came out in 1871. And although the text itself never explicitly talks about dinosaurs or names any of the species that were known, and it's kind of vague that they're primordial monsters in the course of like seeing all of the amazing wonders they saw in the subterranean. The artist actually drew very heavily from the previous traditions of depictions of the primordial world. So we see here, this is very reminiscent of Martin's work, but it also kind of goes back to the Duria in Antiquar, because we have a pterosaur, we have a plesiosaur, we have an ichthyosaur. They just look very dangerous, and there are people down there on the corner of it, actually bearing witness to this, and it is terrifying and horrible, and this is a place that people are not supposed to be. So you can see further that we have prehistoric animals, and over on the right, a field of bones, and it's just very much just not a place that if where these creatures are, humans are not supposed to be. It is of a part of the world that existed before the world had progressed to be appropriate for human occupation. And so we come to Lost World fiction. Lost World fiction, the genre arose out of a number of elements. This awareness of the deep ancient past was coming around. Also, there were basically explorers were coming across, the remnants of ancient civilizations. There were everything from excavating the belly of the kings in the early 19th century in Egypt to the discovery of the actual location of Troy, the abandoned Mayan cities in Central America, various cities and palaces in the Middle East. So these were, these descriptions of, humanity's deep past, and it all got kind of shuffled together in the public mind. And excuse me, what we end up with is basically these stories that well, they have dinosaurs, so they kind of have something in common. If they've got primordial monsters in them, they have this. For some reason, it's locked in time. It's locked in this ancient world before humans, and it survived into our world. So it's got this mysterious rate of slow evolutionary change. It's just a static world. Usually, there's the explorers, which are generally white Europeans. There's not generally; they're always white Europeans. Come across a place where there's some folklore among like the local or the indigenous people that it's a damned place. It's a protected place. It's forbidden, and you should really stay away from it. And you really should listen to us because we live here and we know, but you do you, white European explorer. So when they do inevitably go in there, they find this place where humans are not the dominant species. It is an unconquered land, where it's a place where the characters usually can barely survive their encounters with these monsters. It's often some books would even give the dinosaurs these qualities of a sort of primordial evil, again from this undeveloped world, and so they were physically and morally dangerous. Excuse me. So the first Lost World genre, I apologize, I don't have the slides up for these, is generally considered to be where's my list? Well, it's Solomon's Mines, and which came out in 1885, written by H. Rider Haggard, and it's generally considered to be the first Lost World novel. There is some debate about where the genre actually started. Journey to the Center of the Earth is usually not considered to be a Lost World genre book for a few reasons. But King Solomon's Mines, it's an ancient civilization. There's weird animals, and it also became the model for later books, such as The Man Who Would Be King, 1888, by Rudyard Kipling. Of course, The Lost World by Arthur Conan Doyle in 1912, and then Edgar Rice Burroughs, who wrote several Lost World genres, probably the most famous being The Land That Time Forgot. And arguably it even inspired At the Mountains of Madness by H.P. Lovecraft. Let's see here. So These books were very popular. Dinosaurs just sold, and the illustrations were very, very, just pulled from those traditions, and just straight up copied stuff, like we saw with Journey to the Center of the Earth. And this goes up into the early 19th century as new and more interesting, bigger and more dramatic dinosaurs are being pulled out of the American West and going into these museums. And by the 1900s, many of these museums they've decided that, because generally before this, museums had been they were basically just for research. They were storehouses for specimens. They weren't a thing for the public. They were usually private. They were usually owned by richer people, and this was the tradition in Europe. And but around 1900, in true American fashion, we decided to add capitalism in. Several museums, especially the Carnegie Museum, the American Museum of Natural History, the Field Museum in Chicago, were founded in the late 19th century, and were sponsored or outright owned by various millionaire American barons, essentially, that knew that were looking for philanthropic efforts to improve their relationship with the public. And I'm going over time, Sam, I'm trying to hurry up. And they thought that that dinosaurs were very popular. Dinosaurs sold, and if they could put big, gigantic dinosaurs in museums and make them available to the public, which was a thing that had never really been done before, the hadrosaur being an exception, that basically it would just be a very visible way of, number one, showing off their money into keeping a good relationship with working class people. So in the Museum of Natural History, 1905, opened the Hall of Dinosaurs. Natural History Museum was where Edie Cope was working, and most of the specimens that were in the Hall of Dinosaurs had been studied and processed since they were brought out of the West and prepared. So part of this too, mounting the skeletons, it was very speculative. So it was half a science, half an art, and they actually brought artists in to help with this, with the process of it. And also because these were essentially gigantic PR efforts by very rich people, they had to balance science and also expectations of the public. Before the hall opened, what you could see at the Natural History Museum was these four legs that a person could go and stand next to them and see that they had once been attached to something gigantic, but it still doesn't quite give you the scale like this does. The Brontosaurus was unveiled in 1905. This is the Brontosaurus that went had the head on it wrong. It was put on display, and it was the biggest thing anyone had ever seen, and it just astounded people. And it made the numbers when people went to see the hadrosaur. Just it was nothing. And they made casts and they sold them to other museums. So the Brontosaurus started showing up in fiction, and it showed up in art. And then there became out of this. From the museums hiring artists to help them with their efforts, they got a new tradition of PaleoArt that was mostly developed by Charles Knight, who basically he started hanging out in the taxidermy department of the Natural History Museum because he wanted to learn anatomy, because he was a naturalist painter. He started hanging out with Edie Cope, who got him to start drawing, imagining the live animals from the specimens that they had. And he made them much more dynamic. and his work became so iconic that it's been imitated in paleo art up until pretty much the modern day, until we started changing our ideas of what dinosaurs look like in the current era. Almost anyone who's ever opened a dinosaur book for kids that you find in a public library probably has his stuff in it. And then he would end up being very influential, because this was contemporary to the development of film, of silent film, and he would be very influential on the dinosaur films that were happening in the early 20th century. So this is a very, very famous depiction here of two fighting, what's the Telesaurs, and yeah, this is yeah, again, like I had books as a kid that had this picture in it. This is the Ceratosaurus. We're going to see him again. We see these Brontosauruses hanging out in the swamp. And because, again, Knight was part of an effort to put those skeletons together and to make them more interesting and dynamic. And so what we see here is this Allosaurus having his dinner off of a Brontosaurus skeleton. And here we have an Allosaurus skeleton that has been put back together in a rather dramatic scene, leaning over the also fossil spine of a Brontosaurus. Might be a Diplodocus. Excuse me. So while this is going on, we ended up going into film. There are lots and lots of little experimental animation and silent films from right around 1900 that have just been lost. There are lists of them out there, but they're just, we're never going to see them, because a lot of old early films have been lost because the film actually deteriorates, and it was very flammable. So what we ended up with here, one of the earliest films was Brute Force in 1913, which sort of created, added to the film traditions of dinosaurs, as they come on screen and they instantly start fighting. He did that. It was made by D.W. Griffith, who also is infamous for having made Birth of the Nation, an extremely racist white supremacist movie from also from the era. So he's the one who made dinosaurs on film really violent. And then in 1914, we have Gertie the Dinosaur, who we'll go into more detail in a moment. And then the rest of those films on that list, Dinosaurs in the Missing Link, Prehistoric Poultry, 10,000 BC, Ghost of Slumber Mountain, and Lost World, were all made by Willis O'Brien, who pioneered special effects. And we'll go into that in a moment. So here is Gertie the Dinosaur. Gertie the Dinosaur was, let's see, how am I doing on time? Whoa, okay, I'm hurrying up, Sam. Gertie the Dinosaur was an animated dinosaur that was part of a vaudeville act that, excuse me, Winsor McKay, who is better known for being the creator of the Little Nemo comics, had a show where he would had a projector with him, and he drew a dinosaur on there, and got swapped out for the projector screen when nobody was looking, with a sleight of hand trick. And then suddenly there's this dinosaur that is and he would do this thing where he had a timed response with the dinosaur, and he's telling Gertie to lift her leg and things like that, and she's running around and eating trees. And I would like to show a clip, Sam, of that. Oh, whoops. And okay, so I did it again. Gertie was very popular, so popular that he actually he turned it into a longer film, and turned his dialogue as part of the show, in part of the act, into cards, and as part of the silent film, and that showed all over the United States. I believe it showed in Europe too, and it was also very, very popular. We have a little poster there for him. So now we're going to get into Willis O'Brien. He started out working with Thomas Edison's film company, and made a lot of little experimental films and educational films that have been lost. And then he made this film in association with the Natural History Museum called Ghosts in Slumber Mountain, that was the first movie to have both dinosaurs and people in it. And that work led to him being hired to work on The Lost World, which came out in 1925, and which would lead to him being the head of special effects for King Kong in 1933, which is also a Lost World movie. So The Lost World was just a groundbreaking movie. They invented technology for this. They took existing technology and they brought it to a whole other level. The dinosaurs were, for then, extremely realistic. It was, they came up with techniques, like they put bladders in them to make them breathe while they were on screen. That just blew people's minds. They had them fighting. They had them, just hanging out and looking like animals, and looking more like those pastoral scenes of dinosaurs just hanging out. They featured dinosaurs that were from the Hall of Dinosaurs at the American Natural History Museum. So these were mostly dinosaurs that people knew, they'd seen pictures of more recently. They also had dinosaurs fighting. This was, as you can see, this is a great poster that was from it. It had a romance. It had journalists. It had typical great white explorers in dinosaurs. Lots and lots of dinosaurs. So here we can see that that O'Brien drew directly from Knight's work. This is the same dinosaur, as you can see. All the other dinosaurs are in the movie are very similar to other illustrations that Knight did. Okay, so there is a fight scene that I showed that this morning. I think I'll do the escape Brontosaurus today. Talk about the fight scene we went to. That was basically there's a story that ended Arthur Conan Doyle's friendship with Harry Houdini, because he showed that clip before the movie came out to the he pulled a prank and showed it at the meeting of the American Professional Magicians Society, and it was so impressive that a lot of them thought it was real, and it ended up being very embarrassing for Harry Houdini. Anyways, we're going to show the escape Brontosaurus rampaging through London. Okay, Sam. Okay, so that scene, it's a good example of technologies that he invented or developed. As you can see, that dinosaur is it actually looks pretty convincingly, and it kind of holds up today. Of there's a crowd of people running away from it, and on the same screen that the dinosaur is on, they developed a technique called matting that allowed them to basically film things twice, and it was state of the art back then. That was like what Jurassic Park did for people in the 90s. It was just incredible, and it really just, I don't know. Basically, it reintroduced this idea that dinosaurs and people could be around, and that dinosaurs were maybe out there, because it looked so convincing and real. And it is framed much like the book as the reports of a journalist who went out there and his notes. And yeah, it was very influential. It's been restored recently because they lost like half the film, and they found some in a random box a couple of years ago. And yeah, so it led to it led to King Kong, which was one of the most influential genre movies all time. Which, you know, and that was Willis O'Brien also consulting with museums. And yeah, so basically we go all the way through this journey of biblical illustrations in the 16th, 17th century up to the 1920s, creating brand new technologies to tell stories about dinosaurs. And I apologize that I did not get my bibliography slide done. I will give that to Sam later if we want it.